September of 2019, a check was written. $203,800 written out by hand, every digit and every cent in black ink, on a Wednesday afternoon at a kitchen table in the foothills of western Montana. It was made out to a woman who had not purchased a single pound of commercial livestock feed in 13 years. That check was not an inheritance. It did not come from a settlement or a lawsuit or a distant relative with a guilty conscience. It was not luck. It was not a windfall. It was not money that fell out of the sky onto somebody who had not earned every last dollar of it. It was profit. Clean, honest profit. Every cent of it worked for, waited for, sweated for across 13 years of Montana mornings that came in cold and left without apology. And here is the part that takes some sitting with. The entire foundation of that fortune, the thing that made it possible from the very first day, was something a sawmill on the edge of town used to haul off and bury, something the men who ran that mill called waste, something they paid good money every single week just to make disappear. Her name was Nora Calloway. And in the spring of 2006, when this story truly begins, Nora was 60 years old. I want you to picture her because if you have lived any kind of life at all, you have known a woman like her. Not tall, not loud, not the kind of person who walked into a room and pulled every eye in it. She was the kind of person a room forgot about until the moment it needed her. Hands that showed their history. A face that had been outdoors for 60 years and had not once thought to apologize for it. She wore her late husband's canvas barn coat in the cold months, and her own father's in the colder ones, and she had a way of standing still in front of a problem, a broken gate, a sick animal, a threatening sky that made you feel she was reading something written on it that you simply did not have the eyes to see. She lived on 94 acres of rolling hill country, outside a small town in Sanders County, Montana. Glacial land, the kind of ground the last ice age left behind when it finally dragged itself north, full of rock and old roots and a particular stubbornness that got into the soil and into the people who farmed it. The winters came straight down out of Canada with nothing in between to slow them. The summers were short and brilliant and gone before you had your fill of them. Her family had held that land for 4 generations. Her great-grandfather had come west looking for ground that could not be taken from him, and it had passed down hand to hand, father to child, until it came to rest in Nora's 2 hands. She had buried her husband Thomas on that land. In 2001, a tractor accident on a Tuesday morning in October that took him between one breath and the next. She had buried her only daughter Claire on it in 2008, a long illness that gave them time to prepare and still left them completely unprepared. Claire's boy was named Cole. He was 14 years old. The spring this story begins, all sharp elbows and quiet embarrassment, the way 14-year-old boys are when they are old enough to notice the world watching them, but not yet old enough to stop caring what it thinks. His mother was the daughter Nora had buried, so it was just the 2 of them out there on 94 acres at the end of a gravel lane, the old woman and the boy. Now, Nora Calloway was known around Sanders County for exactly 3 things. The first was her fence lines. Straight. Genuinely, precisely, almost stubbornly straight. You could lay your eye along a row of her posts, the way you would sight down the barrel of a good rifle, and not find a single one a 1/4 inch out of true. People slowed down driving past just to look. A straight fence, her father August had always said, is a promise a person keeps to themselves. The second thing she was known for was that she never threw away a useful length of cord. Not a foot of baling twine, not a piece of binding wire. She had a nail driven into a post just inside the barn door, and on that nail hung a coil of the stuff knotted end to end over the years thick as a man's wrist. "You will want it someday," she would say, and she was always right. The third thing, the thing that matters most for this story, was a belief Nora carried all the way down in her bones. She believed without qualification and without apology that the answer to nearly any problem a person would ever face was already sitting somewhere on their own land. You just had to be patient enough and quiet enough and humble enough to see it. She got that from her father, August Calloway. Everybody called him Gus. He had been dead 15 years by the time this story begins. But Nora still talked to him out loud sometimes in the early mornings when she was working alone. And the only one to hear was the barn cat. Gus had a saying he would repeat with 2 fingers pressed against the side of his head. Not pointing, just resting there thinking. "The land keeps its own books, Nora," he would say. "Most people just never bother to learn how to read them." She kept his desk, an old roll-top dark oak gone almost black with age, nicked and scratched and warm, the way a thing gets warm after 100 years of the same family's hands have been on it. It sat in a small cluttered room at the back of the house, a room that smelled of old paper and the ghost of the pipe tobacco. Gus had smoked at that desk every evening of his adult life. In the bottom drawer of that desk, Nora kept her father's ledgers, thick books, leather-bound pages ruled in fading columns of green and white. Gus's handwriting filled the old ones. Her own filled the newer ones behind them. I want you to hold on to that. The desk and the bottom drawer and the ledgers inside it, because before this story is finished, that one drawer is going to be worth more than every acre of the farm put together. Keep it in the back of your mind. You will know when it matters. Now, let me tell you about the sawmill, because the sawmill is where the trouble starts and where the gift starts, which, in this story, turned out to be the very same thing. It was called Orland Brothers Timber. 2 brothers, Grant and Dwight Orland, had built it in the early 90s on the eastern edge of town, on a flat piece of ground between the highway and a creek. They were good men in the plain working way that good men in small Montana towns tend to be. Grant was the older one, quiet, big-handed, more likely to fix a thing than talk about it. He had known Nora's husband, Thomas, had bought a load of fence posts from him the winter before Thomas died. That is how it works out in the country. The connections run back through people who are no longer living like old fence lines grown over with grass. You follow them anyway because they still mark something true. By 2006, Orland Brothers had grown into a real operation. They ran 3 saws, employed 11 men full-time, and had contracts with 2 regional builders who kept them busy year-round. The mill specialized in hardwood, mostly ponderosa pine from the National Forest timber sales, but also some white oak and hickory from private land to the east. And it was the hardwood particularly, the oak and the hickory, that was causing Grant Orland a problem he had never quite figured out how to solve. Here is what that problem was, in case you have never stood inside a working sawmill on a production day. When you cut hardwood, when you run oak and hickory through a mill at volume, you produce enormous quantities of what the trade calls organic residual. Sawdust bark strips and cuts the wet, fibrous material that comes off the saws in clouds and piles up faster than you can move it. With pine, that residual is dry and relatively easy to manage. With hardwood, it is different. Oak and hickory produce a wet, dense byproduct that packs together and begins to break down almost immediately. Within 48 hours, it starts to ferment. The sugars in the wood begin to convert. It smells sweet at first, almost like bread, and then it goes sour and sharp and heavy in the nose. You cannot store it. You have to move it fast and move it again 2 days later, and again 2 days after that permanently, for as long as the saws keep running. The county landfill charged $60 a ton to take it. By 2006, Orland Brothers was producing close to 16 tons of hardwood residual every week. 16 tons at $60 a ton is $960 a week. 52 weeks a year. That comes to just under $50,000 a year. $50,000 just to make their own byproduct disappear. Just to bury the leftovers of the work they were good at. Grant Orland had been looking for a solution to this for 3 years when he finally climbed into his truck one Tuesday morning in April of 2006 and drove the 6 miles out to the Callaway place. He found Nora out by the equipment shed, replacing a hydraulic line on the old tractor. She did not stop working when his truck pulled up. She finished the connection she was on, wiped her hands on a shop rag, and then she stood and waited for him to say what he had come to say. Grant took off his cap. He explained the problem. The residual, the smell, the cost, the endless hauling. He had heard she kept some cattle and a few head of pigs. Would she have any use for it? He made the offer simple the way honest country deals are simple. His flatbed would come out twice a week every Tuesday and Friday morning, and it would back up to the low corner of her far western field, the strip along the road where the ground sat wet most of the year, and it would dump the material there. He would not charge her a cent for it, and she would not charge him a cent to receive it. Even trade. Neither one beholden to the other. Nora looked out at the spot he was pointing toward. And I need to tell you what that spot was because it matters later in a way you will not believe. It was the sorriest quarter acre on the entire farm. Low ground, poorly drained, cold, and sour in the soil. Nothing had ever grown there, except broom sedge and a few determined weeds that gave up before August every year. If you had asked any farmer in Sanders County to point to the worst dirt on the Callaway place, every single one of them would have pointed to that exact corner. Here is the moment. The small, quiet hinge that the whole rest of this story swings on. Grant Orland thought Nora was looking at the ground, weighing whether the trouble was worth it thinking about her animals. But Nora was not looking at the ground at all. Her eyes had gone past it out to the middle distance, to the particular faraway place a person looks when they are not seeing what is in front of them. They are seeing something that does not exist yet, something that lives for now only inside their own mind. She was not thinking about her cattle. She nodded slow and once. "That will work," she said. And that was the whole agreement. No paper. No lawyer, no contract, no clause, no signature on any line. 2 people and a handshake on a Tuesday morning in April, with the dew still on the fence wire. The next Friday, the first truck came, and for the next 13 years, for 676 Tuesdays and 676 Fridays. Rain or snow or the flat baking heat of a Montana August, a truck from Orland Brothers Timber would rumble down that gravel lane and back up to that fence corner and dump a steaming sour-sweet pile of what the whole mill called garbage onto Nora Callaway's worst piece of ground. And here is the very first thing nobody saw coming. She did not feed it to her cattle. She did not feed it to her pigs. The first load sat where it landed, and the second load came and sat on top of it, and the pile grew. For months, Nora did almost nothing with it. She watched it. I know how that sounds. A 60-year-old woman, a serious working farmer, walking down to her fence corner in the early morning to stand and look at a pile of sawmill waste. But that is precisely what she did. She watched how the rain moved through it. She watched how the July heat baked a dry gray crust over the top, while the material underneath stayed warm and working and alive. She watched the deer come at dusk, cautious and curious to nose at the edges. She took a shovelful in a bucket, mixed it with a handful of soil, and watched over several weeks how it broke down into something black and fine and richly, almost sweetly alive. She was learning what it was, learning what it wanted to become. Cole thought she had finally gone soft in the head. Standing at the fence in the cold with her coffee going cold in her hand, staring at a heap of sawdust and wood shavings like it owed her something. "Grandma," he said one evening from the porch with the particular 14-year-old combination of love and mortification that is one of the stranger gifts of that age. "That pile smells like a barn floor in July. Why can't you just leave it alone?" Nora looked out at her pile of waste. She smiled just slightly, the way a person smiles at a secret they are not ready to share yet. "This is better," she said, "and it is free." But it was never really about free. You need to understand that now and hold on to it the way you are holding on to the desk and the ledger. Not for one single day was any of what Nora Calloway built about getting something for nothing. It was about something she could not yet put into words a 14-year-old boy would have any use for. It was about building something that fed itself, something that answered to nobody, something that could stand on its own ground and owe no man a debt and no corporation a favor. So that pile of waste by the fence corner was about to become the foundation under everything. And the woman watching it grow already knew. In October of 2006, Nora did a thing that made all of Sanders County certain she had lost her grip on good sense. She got into her pickup truck, and she drove 400 miles most of the way across the state, and then some down through the high country and into the warmer valleys. And she came home after dark with 4 young pigs loaded in a crate she had built herself in the bed of the truck. Scrap lumber and chicken wire tight enough to hold simple enough to build in an afternoon. She had paid $1,400 cash for those 4 pigs. $1,400. People shook their heads. But here is why they shook their heads. These were not the pigs you saw at any other operation in Sanders County. These were not the fast pink commercial hogs that the big confinement operations ran by the 1,000 bred for nothing but weight and speed and the ability to convert cheap corn into market pounds as efficiently as a machine. These were Ossabaw Island hogs, a heritage breed. Old stock descended from Spanish pigs left on an island off the Georgia coast by explorers 500 years ago, isolated long enough to develop into something genuinely different from anything the modern hog industry recognized as useful. They were small and dark, more muscle than fat on first look, but carrying a peculiar dense lard under the skin, the kind that came from centuries of feast and famine cycles on an island where food was sometimes plentiful and sometimes not. Their snouts were long and mobile and built for serious rooting. Their legs were short and sturdy. They were calm animals, unhurried, almost meditative in the way they moved through a space. And they were built by their history to extract nutrition from things other pigs would walk right past. Acorns, hard mast, root systems, fermented woody material that a commercial hog's gut could not begin to process. The fat that Ossabaw pigs produced when they were raised the right way out in the open on varied forage was something from another century entirely, marbled through the muscle, dense and clean and flavored in a way that people who tasted it stopped talking about for a moment before they said anything, because they needed that moment to understand what they were experiencing. There was one problem with them. As far as the modern hog industry was concerned, they grew slowly. Not fast, not efficiently, not in a way that made any kind of sense on a commodity spreadsheet. And in an industry that measured every living thing in pounds of gain per day, and how fast you could convert cheap feed into heavy weight, and heavy weight into money, a slow-growing pig was not a heritage treasure. It was a liability, a relic, a waste of a good barn and perfectly good feed. Every banker and every extension agent and every sensible commercial farmer in Sanders County would have told Nora Calloway she was pouring $1,400 into the ground. She put her 3 young gilts and her 1 young boar into 5 acres of mixed timber she had fenced off on the north end of the property, old ponderosa and some white oak, deep shade in the summer, a good carpet of fallen mast in the autumn. She built them a 3-sided shelter from reclaimed lumber, open to the south, backed against the north wind. And then she started feeding them. Every morning, Nora would drive her utility cart down to the fence corner and load it with the fermented hardwood residual, the oak and hickory material that had been breaking down now for months in that wet, low corner. She did not dump it in a trough. She broadcast it, wide, threw it out across the duff and the pine needles in a long scatter so the pigs had to move to find. It had to root it up, had to work for every mouthful the way pigs are built to work. And while they rooted for the fermented wood material, which was by now hosting a dense community of fungi and bacteria that converted the wood sugars into bioavailable protein and fat, they were doing something else without anyone directing them to do it. They were turning the earth, working their waste down into it, making that timber floor richer with every single day that passed. The oak and hickory residual was the base of their diet, the steady carbohydrate and fermented protein. But Nora had figured out, watching her compost bucket break down on the back porch through the fall, that it was not a complete diet on its own. So she let the hogs range the acorns freely in the autumn, which the Ossabaw bloodline was specifically engineered by 5 centuries of island living to process. She drove 3 miles to an old abandoned orchard nobody tended anymore and filled the truck bed with fallen apples, bruised and fragrant and perfect. She made a standing arrangement with the small grocery in town to take all their unsellable produce, the wilted heads of lettuce, the soft squash, the tomatoes gone past their sell-by date. She hauled it home twice a week in plastic totes in the bed of the truck. Those 4 pigs and the growing herd that followed them ate a different meal every day of their lives. Fermented wood mash and acorns and apples and garden surplus, all of it eaten out in the open air, in the dirt, in the shade of old trees. The way pigs lived 100 years before anyone built the first confinement barn. The first year was hard. The first year is always hard. When the first group of Ossabaw hogs was grown and ready, Nora loaded 9 of them and hauled them to the regional livestock auction in the county seat. And it is right there, in that auction barn on a cold Saturday morning in the early winter, that this story turns for the first time. The barn was full. Saturday full. Farmers leaning on the steel top rails. The auctioneer's chant rolling out over the loudspeaker in that particular sing-song rhythm that sounds like its own language if you have not grown up with it. The smell of the place, which is a smell that gets into your coat and rides home with you. Sawdust and diesel and animals and cold coffee and the particular human smell of people who work outdoors for a living crowded into an enclosed space. And at the front of the ring, where the serious buyers stood with their numbered paddles, was a man named Preston Wade. You need to know Preston Wade. Preston Wade ran the largest hog operation in 3 counties. Big steel confinement barns, climate-controlled slatted floors, automated feeding systems, 3,000 head turning over on a continuous cycle. He was a heavy, prosperous man, with the particular ease of someone who has been right about enough things for long enough that being right has started to feel like a permanent condition. He wore a clean-pressed shirt even on auction Saturdays. His handshake was the kind that told you something. He had an opinion about every operation in the county, about who was farming seriously and who was just playing at it. And he delivered those opinions without being asked and without apparent concern for how they landed. When Nora's dark Ossabaw hogs came shuffling through the ring compact, an unhurried built low to the ground, Preston Wade started to laugh. It was not a quiet laugh. It was a big, generous, room-filling laugh, the kind that invites everyone else in earshot to join in. "Well, now," he said loud enough to carry, "looks like Nora Calloway brought us some wood-chip pigs." He shook his head, grinning wide at the men around him. fed on sawmill slop and sour oak dust. The whole pen smells like a lumber yard. A few men chuckled, and Preston Wade, hearing it, opened up. He had an audience now, and he knew what to do with one. "What are you getting for these things, Nora?" He called out across the ring. "You planning on selling them or just renting out the smell?" The laughter swelled. It went around that barn and came back around again louder the second time. Men laughing, a few looking away, the auctioneer pausing, letting it run its course. And Nora Calloway stood there, in the middle of it. 60 years old, a widow. A woman who had buried her husband and then buried her daughter, and was raising that daughter's boy alone. She felt every eye in that barn swing around and settle on her. She felt the heat come up the back of her neck, the way it does when a whole room decides to look at you all at once, and not for a reason you would choose. She felt for one long moment exactly the way Preston Wade intended her to feel. Small, foolish, out of place in her own county. But she did not look at her boots. Every instinct she had told her to go quiet, to wait it out, to let it pass. The way you wait out bad weather under a tin roof. That is what most people do. That is the easy thing, and there is nothing wrong with it. Instead, Nora Calloway lifted her chin. She turned her head slow, and she found Preston Wade's face in the crowd. And she looked at him directly. And when she spoke, her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The room went quiet to catch it. The way a room goes quiet when someone decides not to flinch. "I am not raising these for your auction, Mr. Wade," she said. "I am raising them for a market that does not exist yet." For a second, nobody said anything. Then Preston Wade laughed again, wiping his eye with his knuckle. "A market that does not exist yet," he repeated, drawing it out, making a gift of it for the room. "Well, sweetheart, you be sure and let the rest of us know when it shows up." That day, Nora's hogs sold for 61 cents a pound. Live weight. Ordinary, unremarkable, nothing special money. She took it. She paid to have 2 animals processed for the family freezer. And she drove the 6 miles home in the early dark with the window down and the cold air on her face and the radio off. Cole was home. He had been at the auction. He had been standing near the back, close enough to hear everything. Close enough to watch his grandmother stand in the middle of a barn full of laughing men and not look down. He had felt the heat of it himself. The second-hand shame that is somehow worse than the direct kind. Because you cannot even do anything with it. It just sits there in your chest with nowhere to go. He did not say anything when they got home. He went to his room and he lay on his bed in the dark. And he stared at the ceiling and he thought about things a 14-year-old thinks about when he begins to understand that the world is willing to be cruel and that the people he loves are not protected from it. And here is what Nora was doing at that same moment 6 rooms away in the small back office that smelled of old paper and her father's pipe tobacco. She was sitting at the roll-top desk. She had the lamp on, and she was opening the bottom drawer and taking out the ledger and opening it to a fresh page and writing down in her careful, even hand the date and the number of animals sold and the price per pound and the total received and the name of the buyer and every cost she had incurred to get to that day, every dollar of feed, every mile of fuel. The cost of the crate she had built for the truck, the vet visit in September, all of it, accounted for, recorded, kept. She was not discouraged. She had never been building for that barn. She had stood up in front of the whole county and told them the plain exact truth of what she was doing, and they had laughed at her for it. A market that does not exist yet. She meant it when she said it. She means it still. Let me ask you something before we go any further down this gravel lane. Have you ever been laughed at for believing in something that nobody else could see yet? Have you ever stood in a room, a sale barn, a bank office, a family kitchen, a place full of people who had all quietly agreed among themselves that you were a fool and walked out anyway and kept going? Have you ever driven home in the dark after a day like that and gotten up the next morning and done the work one more time? Because if you have, if you know exactly what that drive home feels like and exactly what it costs to turn the truck around and go back, then I think you and Nora Calloway would have understood each other without needing very many words. And I think whatever it is you are holding on to right now, the thing they laughed at, the thing they said would never work, might not be as foolish as the room made it feel. Stay with me, because that market she talked about, the one that did not exist yet, was already forming somewhere out there in the world. It was already finding its way north and west toward a gravel lane in Sanders County, Montana. And the man who had laughed loudest in that barn was going to need Nora Calloway before this was finished, in a way he could not yet begin to imagine. The truck came twice a week. Tuesday and Friday, reliable as the seasons, the pile in the low corner of the west field became a permanent feature of the land. A low working mound of fermenting hardwood material that steamed in the cold months and hummed with insect life in the warm ones. And Nora was careful about her herd, in the way that a serious person is careful about something they intend to build across a long time. She kept only the best gilts back for breeding, and she did not choose them by weight or by how fast they grew. She chose them by temperament, by how calm a sow stayed when the weather turned hard, by how carefully she tended a litter, by how she moved through the timber unhurried and purposeful. Nora was breeding patience into her own animals year over year, the way her father had bred endurance into his cattle, the way the land had bred it into her. And while she did that quietly out at the end of her gravel lane with the mountains going blue in the evening light, the world was beginning to change in a way that would eventually come rolling all the way out to that low corner of the west field. Because somewhere out there in the cities, in the better restaurants, something was happening. People had started to care again about where their food came from. It was a small thing at first, a handful of young cooks who were tired of the pale, lean, tasteless factory pork that everyone bought by the case because it was cheap and consistent and completely without character. They wanted pork that tasted like something, pork with fat, pork with a story behind it that was worth putting on a menu, and a heritage hog raised out in the open on hardwood mast and fermented oak residual and windfall apples, walking miles a day, eating 50 different things that animal had fat, the likes of which had not been tasted in this country in 50 years. Dense, clean, marbled all the way through. The kind of fat the good cooks knew was exactly where the flavor lived. Nora Calloway had been building toward that moment for years. She had not known which morning it would arrive, but she had known it was coming. She had kept the books. She had read the land, and out in the west field on the quarter-acre of ground that every farmer in Sanders County would have called the worst dirt on the Calloway place, something else was happening that nobody was watching closely enough to notice. The fermented hardwood material was breaking down. Season after season, load after load, rain driving it down into the clay subsoil, the weight of winter compressing it, the heat of summer accelerating the decomposition. The fungal networks in the oak and hickory residual were colonizing the soil around it, converting the raw material into something dark and fine and almost impossibly rich. The worst ground on the farm was becoming something else entirely. Slowly, without announcement, the way the best things always happen. Nora knew. She walked down there on the cold mornings with her coffee, and she pushed the toe of her boot into the edge of it and watched the dark material give way like something living, something that wanted to open up. She did not say anything about it to anyone. Some things you do not talk about until they are finished. You just tend them. You just keep showing up. You just keep the books. And you trust what the land is telling you, even when the whole county is driving past and looking at your straight fence lines and your steaming pile of sawmill waste and deciding quietly and with great confidence that they understand what they are seeing. They did not understand what they were seeing. Nora walked back up the lane toward the house in the early light. The mountains were going pink above the timber. The pigs were moving in the trees to the north. Dark shapes in the mist unhurried. Cole's light was on in his room. The blue glow of something on a screen. A boy who was becoming someone she could not quite see, yet heading somewhere she could not follow. She went inside. She hung the canvas coat on its hook. She put the coffee cup in the sink. She went to her father's office and she sat down at his desk and she opened the bottom drawer and she took out the ledger and she opened it to the current page and she picked up the pen and she wrote down the date and the state of the herd and the weather and the condition of the land. Everything that had come in. Everything that had gone out. The weight of it all in careful columns on a ruled page. The land keeps its own books, her father's voice said from somewhere close. She turned the page, wrote the next entry. Most people just never bother to learn how to read them. For the next several years, the rhythm of the farm held steady, the way good rhythms do not, because nothing changed, but because the changes were slow and deliberate and rooted deep enough to hold against the weather. The truck came Tuesday and Friday. The pile in the west corner grew and broke down, and grew again a living thing now, not just a heap. The Ossabaw herd expanded season by season, Nora adding only what the land could carry. Never more replacing the older sows with the best daughters from the best litters, always selecting for the same qualities she had selected for from the beginning. Patience, calm, the ability to do well on difficult ground without anyone making it easier for them. Cole grew up the way boys grow up on working farms, fast in the body and slower everywhere else. He helped in the mornings before school without being asked because that was simply how things worked on a Callaway property. Labor was not optional and had never been presented as such. He could back a trailer by the time he was 15 and read a sick animal's posture by the time he was 16, and he knew how to run a fence line true because Nora had made sure of it, the same way her father had made sure with her. But there was something underneath all of it that neither of them talked about. A distance that had been growing in Cole since that Saturday in the auction barn, since the sound of Preston Wade's laughter filling that building from wall to wall, and Cole standing in the back feeling it land on him secondhand and not knowing what to do with what it left behind. He never talked about that day. Nora never brought it up, but it was there between them the way things are there when two people who love each other have both decided separately and for different reasons not to name something. The summer Cole was 17, a group of boys from town came out to the property on a Saturday afternoon, 3 of them. The kind of loose, aimless Saturday that happens when you are 17 and the day has not organized itself into anything useful. They came around the back of the equipment shed, and they stopped when they saw the west field. The pile, the low, steaming mound of fermented wood material that had been building for going on 4 years by then. One of the boys said something. Cole did not repeat it to Nora, and Nora never learned the exact words, but she heard from the kitchen window the laughter. Young laughter. The particular careless cruelty of boys performing for each other. And she heard Cole's voice in the middle of it laughing too. And she understood without needing to see it exactly what kind of laugh it was. The laugh of someone trying to get to the other side of something before it can touch them. She turned back to the stove. She did not go outside. 2 years later, Cole left for the State University in Missoula on a partial academic scholarship, and a pride he did not quite know how to carry. Nora drove him, helped him carry 3 boxes and a duffel bag up 2 flights of stairs in a dormitory that smelled of industrial cleaning solution and other people's decisions. She did not linger. She hugged him once hard and brief, and she said what she always said when she meant the most. You know where home is. And she drove the 140 miles back to Sanders County alone in the September dark. He called the first semester with some regularity, less the second. By the time he had transferred into the business program at the start of his sophomore year, and found his footing in a version of life that looked nothing like a gravel lane in western Montana. The calls came maybe twice a month. Short and careful conversations that stayed on the surface of things by mutual and unspoken agreement. He did not talk about the farm. She did not ask him to. Nora worked. That is what she did with the space Cole's absence left. She worked the way she had always worked, methodically and without self-pity up before light, and not done until the last thing was done. The particular discipline of someone who knows that the land does not take a day off because you are tired or sad, or feeling the weight of your own age in your knees on a cold morning. The Ossabaw herd was at 32 sows by the fall of 2011. She had started selling direct to a handful of restaurants. Nothing formal yet, just word of mouth working its way south from the county. A chef in Kalispell who had driven up on a rumor and walked the timber with her and gone home quiet. In that particular way, people go quiet when they have just tasted something that reorganizes their understanding of what food can be. He told another chef. That chef called, and the thing began to move slow and steady the way Nora had always known real things move. Then the winter came. Not the ordinary winter that comes to western Montana every year, and is hard in the way all Montana winters are hard, and is survived and forgotten by May. This was the winter of 2013, which arrived in November, and decided to stay, which sent temperatures down past 20 below in December, and held them there into February, which loaded the roofs with ice and turned the water lines into problems and made every morning on the property a renegotiation with the cold. Nora had weathered hard winters her whole life. She knew the work they required, and she did the work without complaint. The extra bedding the heated waterers checked twice a day. The animals monitored for the particular posture and behavior that tells an experienced eye that something is beginning to go wrong before it has gone wrong far enough to be obvious to anyone else. She saw it in one sow on a Wednesday morning in late January. Something off in the way the animal was standing, a reluctance, a stillness that was not the ordinary calm stillness of an Ossabaw, but something else, something careful. The stillness of an animal that is managing pain. By Thursday evening, there were 2 more. By Friday morning, Nora was on the phone with the vet. What came through the herd that winter was a respiratory illness, not the catastrophic PRRS that had devastated commercial operations elsewhere, but something related, something that moved through the younger animals and the older breeding sows with a speed and persistence that resisted the treatments they tried. The vet came twice. Nora sat up nights in the shelter with a lantern and a thermos of coffee, checking breathing, checking temperatures, doing what could be done and grieving quietly over what could not. She lost a litter on a Thursday night, and another on the following Tuesday, and 2 breeding sows in the same week. In February, animals she had selected and kept and bred with care across 7 years of patient work. By the time the illness ran its course in early March, Nora Calloway had lost 36% of her breeding herd. Not a majority, but close enough to a third that the years of work it represented sat in her chest like a stone that would not move. She walked out into the timber on the first morning the temperature rose above 0, and stood in the pale winter light, among the osabao that had survived watching them move through the trees, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She did not know if she could continue. She was 67 years old. She had been doing this alone for 7 years. The customers she had built, the chefs who had started to call the thing, she had been constructing slowly and patiently, from something the whole world called garbage. All of it felt on that particular cold morning in that particular patch of timber very far from certain. Cole was 21 years old. He was in Missoula, deep in the second semester of his junior year, building toward a marketing degree, building toward a version of himself that wore clean clothes to work in a warm office in a city where nobody knew his grandmother raised strange pigs on fermented sawdust in a corner of western Montana. He did not know what the winter had taken from the herd. Nora had not told him. She had not wanted to become in his mind a problem that needed solving. She had not wanted to hear in his voice even briefly the particular careful kindness that people use when they are already mentally composing the argument for why something should end. On a Friday morning in early March, Nora drove into town. She told herself she was going to the hardware store for hydraulic fittings. She did not go to the hardware store. She drove to the edge of town, to the place where the main road widened and the last gas station sat before the highway opened up into open country. And she pulled over and put the truck in park and sat there with the engine running and the heater working against her knees. She sat for a long time. It would be easy, she thought. Not a complicated thing. A few phone calls, a conversation with Harold Briggs at the agricultural bank, a man who had known her father and would be kind about it. The land was worth real money now, more than August Calloway had ever dreamed it would be worth. She was 67 years old, and she was tired in a way that went below the muscles, a tiredness that had gotten into something deeper than she had names for. Cole had his own life taking shape. The auction barn memory was 7 years old. Nobody in Sanders County was laughing at her anymore, but nobody was paying attention either. And on that cold morning, with her hands on the steering wheel and the bare fields running away to the mountains on both sides of the road, she felt the pull of simply letting it go, setting it down, letting someone else carry whatever it was she had been carrying since the first truck came down the lane. Her hand moved to the door handle. She sat there with her hand on it, and she looked up and caught her own face in the side mirror. An old woman in her father's canvas coat, the collar worn at the corners, the pockets permanently shaped by 30 years of her hands going in and out of them. Below the mirror, her own hands on the wheel, the knuckles enlarged by cold and work, the calluses built up along the palm in ridges that no amount of anything would ever fully soften. 40 years of work written into the skin of her own hands where she could not wash it out, and she heard him. Not a voice, exactly. More a certainty the way a true thing presents itself. Sometimes not as a sound, but as a weight, a pressure, something that has been there all along and has only now made itself felt. Gus, 2 fingers at the side of his head. Not hurrying, never hurrying. The land keeps its own books, Nora. Most people just never learn how to read them. She took her hand off the door handle. She sat for another moment. Then she put the truck in gear, and she made a slow turn in the empty road, and she drove the 6 miles back to the farm. She went inside, and she poured a cup of coffee, and she went to her father's office, and she sat down at the roll-top desk, and she pulled the bottom drawer open, and she took out the ledgers. All of them, going back to 2006. She opened them on the desk in front of her, and she began to read. She read for most of the morning. What the books showed her in the plain, unargumentative language of recorded fact was something her grief had kept hidden from her out in the timber. The illness had moved through the herd without discrimination in terms of age or size, but it had not moved through all bloodlines equally. When she tracked the animals she had lost against the animals that had come through the winter. Without serious illness, a pattern emerged from the columns of careful handwriting that was too consistent to be coincidence. The sows from 3 specific breeding lines animals she had selected over 7 years specifically for temperament and resilience, and the ability to thrive on difficult ground. Those animals had come through the illness at a rate nearly 3 times higher than the rest of the herd. She had not lost her best animals. The illness had found the weakness in her herd and taken it. What remained, what was standing in the timber right now, pawing at the thawing ground, was the most resilient core of what she had been building. She was not starting over. She was starting from the strongest place she had ever been. Nora sat at her father's desk for a long time after she understood this, her hands flat on the open ledger looking at the columns of her own handwriting running back through 7 years of mornings. Then she closed the book and put it back in the drawer, and closed the drawer and stood up and put on her coat and went back to work. She told Cole almost none of this when he called the following Sunday. She asked about his classes. She asked about whether he was eating properly. She did not mention the winter, the losses, the morning at the edge of town with her hand on the door handle. Some things a person carries alone not because they are too heavy to share, but because sharing them before they are finished would change what they become. She was not finished yet. Over the following 2 years, Nora rebuilt. She was precise about it. More precise than she had been the first time around, because now she had 7 years of records, and she knew exactly which bloodlines to build from, and exactly what she was selecting for. The herd came back to full strength by 2015, and it came back better than it had been before, the winter leaner in the weak places, denser in the strong ones. A herd that had been tested by something real and had produced from what survived a next generation that carried the test in its blood. In the spring of 2015, a young woman named Jessie from a restaurant in Missoula drove 3 hours north to the farm because a chef she had worked under had mentioned an Ossabaw operation in Sanders County that was doing something worth seeing. She was 28 years old and had just taken over as head chef at a farm-to-table restaurant that her boss had staked his reputation on, and she was looking for pork that was worth putting on a menu that people drove across the city to eat from. She did not ask about feed conversion ratios. She did not ask about days to market. She walked the timber with Nora and crouched down in the leaf litter and pushed her bare hand into the black soil of the west field, the old pile site, and brought it up to her face and smelled it. The rich, deep smell of ground that has been fed and worked and lived in for 9 years. She looked at the animals, the way they moved, the brightness of their eyes, the healthy darkness of their coats, the particular purposeful quality of the way they covered ground. "What do you feed them?" she asked. Nora told her. Plain and simple. The fermented hardwood residual, the oak and hickory material from the mill, the acorns in the fall, the apples from the old orchard down the road, the produce from the grocery in town. Jessie's whole face changed as she listened. The way a face changes when something confirms what it had been hoping to hear, but had stopped expecting to find. She bought 4 hogs that afternoon on the spot, at a price that made the numbers from the auction barn 7 years ago seem like a bad dream. Not 61 cents a pound. Live weight. Dressed weight, hanging weight after processing. She offered $380 a pound. The same animal that would have brought Nora perhaps $160 on a good auction day was worth, sold this way, close to $700, more than 4 times the money for the identical animal. The only thing that had changed was that someone finally knew what they were looking at. Cole happened to be home that weekend, back for a few days between semesters. He was standing at the edge of the timber when the transaction happened. He watched Jessie from the restaurant treat his grandmother's hogs with a reverence that he did not have a word for, watched her smell the soil and look at the animals, the way someone looks at something genuinely rare. And then he watched the number get written into his grandmother's ledger. He walked out to the west field after Jesse's car had gone back down the lane. He stood at the edge of the old pile site, the quarter acre that had been the worst ground on the farm for as long as anyone could remember, and he looked at it. The soil there was dark now, genuinely dark. Not the gray, waterlogged clay it had been in 2006, but something that looked like it belonged in a different county entirely. He pushed his boot into the edge of it. It gave under the pressure like something that was alive. He did not say anything. He went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then he got out his laptop and he built his grandmother a website. One page, a few photographs. He took himself the following morning the timber, the animals, the black soil in the west field, Nora's hands holding an ear of corn from the garden. The story of the farm written plain, no performance in it, just the facts set down cleanly. A phone number at the bottom. He drove back to Missoula at the end of the weekend. The phone started ringing within 2 weeks. But there is a thing you need to know about Cole before we go any further. The website was not redemption. Building it did not undo 7 years of distance, did not erase the laughter he had joined in. Beside the equipment shed when he was 17, did not close the gap that had opened between him and his grandmother. In the auction barn when he was 14 and had not fully closed since. He built the website, and he drove back to the city, and he went back to his life. And the distance was still there. Quieter now, but present the way a fence line stays in the ground even after the posts have rotted down. He had not yet done the thing that would close it. He did not yet know what that thing was. Now let me tell you about Derek Sims. Because Derek Sims is where the next part of this story lives, and you need to understand him fully before you can understand what he did and what it cost. Orland Brothers Timber had changed in the years since Grant and Dwight had started it on a flat piece of ground between the highway and the creek. Growth will do that to a place. By 2015, the operation had brought in outside investment, a regional equity group that had bought a minority stake in 2012 and had been since then applying the particular kind of pressure that outside investors apply, the pressure of people who understand money very well and understand everything else only in terms of money. Grant Orland was still nominally in charge, but the decisions that mattered were increasingly made by people who had never run a saw, or worked a green chain, or smelled the particular warm-bread smell of freshly cut hardwood on a winter morning. Derek Sims was 31 years old when he arrived at Orland Brothers in the fall of 2015 with the title of Operations Efficiency Director and a mandate from the equity group to find costs to cut and revenue to unlock. He had a business degree and a supply chain background, and the particular sharp confidence of someone who has been told often enough that he is smart, that he has stopped questioning whether the people telling him are right. He wore work jackets that were new enough to still have the crease from the hanger. He drove a truck that had never hauled anything heavier than a bag of groceries. Everything in the world to Derek Sims was a system to be mapped and measured and optimized. Every cost was a leak to be plugged. Every waste stream was a profit center waiting for someone clever enough to unlock it. He went through the Orland books with the thorough efficiency of someone who has been trained to find exactly this kind of thing. And in the waste disposal line, he found what he was looking for. The arrangement with the Callaway farm was not in any contract. There was no paperwork anywhere, just a note in Grant Orland's own handwriting tucked into the back of an old folder Callaway arrangement. Twice weekly. No charge either direction. Handshake deal April 2006. Grant. To Derek Sims, this was not a record of a neighborly agreement that had worked well for nearly a decade. It was an unmanaged liability. Yeah, an asset being given away for nothing. He found a company called Biomass Pacific based outside of Spokane, 220 miles to the west, which had recently invested in a new pelletizing technology that could convert wet hardwood residual into compressed fuel pellets for industrial boilers. They were actively seeking raw material sources. They were offering $48 per ton. The mill was producing close to 18 tons of residual per week by 2015. Derek ran the numbers. $48 times 18 tons times 52 weeks came to $44,928 per year. Found money in his view. Revenue sitting there uncollected. The mill was carrying debt from the 2012 expansion, and the equity group was leaning on the operating numbers. This was, as far as Derek Sims was concerned, not a complicated decision. He drove out to the Callaway farm on a Tuesday morning in October of 2016. He found Nora in the barnyard working a compost windrow with a pitchfork. She was 70 years old, sleeves rolled past her elbows, working the way she had worked every day of her life without hurry and without waste of motion. The particular economy of someone who has been doing physical work long enough that it has become a kind of fluency. Derek introduced himself. Firm handshake, professional smile. The rehearsed ease of someone who has learned to project confidence as a management technique. He pulled out a tablet and turned the screen toward her and began to explain the new arrangement. The Biomass Pacific contract, the pelletizing technology, the revenue opportunity for the mill. He used the word sustainability twice. He said optimized resource utilization. He said value chain alignment. Nora did not look at the tablet. She wiped her hands on the front of her work pants, and she looked at Derek Sims with the same expression she used when she was reading Weather Patient and attentive and entirely without alarm. This arrangement has worked well for 10 years, she said. Do not see the need to change it. Derek pressed on. He was good at this. It was most of his professional skill. He talked about liability exposure, about the mill's insurance requirements, about the fact that the current arrangement had no formal documentation and represented a risk to both parties. He talked about indemnification. He was careful to frame all of it as protection for Nora as much as for the mill. Nora listened to all of it. She nodded along slow, the way she nodded at things she could not change and had decided not to argue with. You do what you need to do, she said at last, and she picked up the pitchfork and went back to the windrow. Derek drove back to the mill believing the matter was settled cleanly and professionally, and to everyone's benefit. He had no way of knowing what Nora said quietly to the compost pile after his truck turned off the lane and the sound of his engine faded into the distance. She said, "You think you have been giving me something for nothing all this time. But you have not. You have been paying me. Every Tuesday and every Friday for 10 years. And I have been investing every load." The last delivery came on a Friday in November of 2016. The driver was a man named Vernon Briggs, no relation to the banker who had been making the Callaway run for 5 years, and who climbed down from the cab that last afternoon and could not quite bring himself to meet Nora's eyes. "I'm sorry about this, Mrs. Callaway," he said, turning his cap over and over in both hands. "It does not seem right to me. It is not your doing," Vernon, Nora told him. And she meant it without reservation. He dumped the last load. The engine of his truck faded up the lane. The quiet that came after was the heaviest quiet Nora had stood in since the morning she buried Thomas. The system was broken. The free thing was gone. For any other operation in the county, that would have been the end of the story. But Nora Callaway had been getting ready for this day for 10 years without knowing which day it would be. And the work she had done in that low corner of the west field was not undone by the last truck leaving. It was finished. That evening, she went to her father's office, lit the lamp, opened the bottom drawer, and spread the ledgers on the desk. She called Cole. He was in Missoula 3 years into a marketing job at a mid-sized firm, the version of himself that wore collared shirts to an office in a building with a parking structure. He answered on the third ring with the carefully neutral greeting of someone who has learned to manage expectations in both directions. She told him what had happened, not dramatically, not with self-pity, just the plain facts set down in the order they had occurred. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would come home that weekend. He drove up on a Saturday morning and he found Nora at the kitchen table with the ledgers open and a yellow legal pad and the old calculator from the desk drawer that was older than he was. He sat down across from her. They poured coffee, and they began. They worked through the weekend methodically, starting at 2006 and moving forward. First, they calculated the total volume of hardwood residual received across 10.5 years. Grant's early deliveries had averaged around 15 tons per week. The later years, as the mill expanded, had been closer to 18. Cole split the difference conservatively at 16.5 tons per week. 16.5 times 52 weeks times 10.5 years. He ran it through twice. The number was 8,981 tons of hardwood residual. Then he multiplied by the price Derek Sims had cited, $48 per ton. The price the mill had been offered by Biomass Pacific for raw material. It had been dumping on Nora's worst piece of ground for a decade. Cole wrote the number on the legal pad and turned it to face his grandmother. $431,088. He set the pencil down. He looked at the number. He looked at his grandmother. He was 24 years old, and he had a degree in business. And he had spent 3 years working in a marketing firm, analyzing consumer behavior and brand value. And he understood in that moment, sitting at his grandmother's kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon, that he had not known the first thing about any of it. That was the investment, he said quietly. That was what she had meant, standing in the barnyard while Derek Sims showed her a tablet she had not looked at, telling a 31-year-old efficiency director something he did not have the framework to understand. You have not been giving me something for nothing. You have been paying me. And I have been investing every load. She had taken $430,000 in raw material, delivered load by load twice a week across a decade, and through nothing except her own labor and her own knowledge and her own unbreakable patience. She had converted it into a debt-free herd of heritage hogs with a waiting list into 40 acres of the most fertile ground in Sanders County, into direct relationships with restaurant buyers across the state who would pay prices that made the auction barn seem like a different century. Grandma Cole said. He stopped, started again. You knew this the whole time. I knew what it could become, Nora said. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. That is not the same thing as knowing what it is. Worth means nothing at all until somebody does the work. Cole sat with that for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the November light was going thin and gold across the west field. He could see the dark corner. The quarter acre, the ground that had been sour waterlogged clay when he was 14 years old, holding his nose at the first delivery. The ground that was now black to a depth of 2 feet, with the richest soil on the property. He thought about a Saturday afternoon when he was 17 and some boys from town had laughed and he had laughed with them. He thought about the auction barn and Preston Wade and the sound of 61 cents per pound announced over a loudspeaker. He thought about 400 miles of highway and a dormitory staircase and 3 years of careful phone calls that stayed on the surface of things. He did not say any of that. He picked up the pencil and turned to a fresh page on the legal pad. Tell me what you need, he said. They went to the bank on Tuesday morning. They dressed for it the way the Calloway family had always dressed for serious business, not formally but cleanly and without apology. They put the ledgers in a canvas bag, and they drove to town, and they sat down across the wide desk from Harold Briggs, whose own father had once bought a load of fence posts from Nora's husband Thomas in a barn lot 30 years ago, and they set the ledgers on the desk and they opened them. They were not asking for a rescue. They were not two people sitting across from a banker with their hats in their hands, asking someone to keep a failing operation from going under. They were asking for capital to expand a proven and profitable business, one that had a decade of records behind it, and signed letters of intent from 11 restaurant buyers who wanted more product than Nora could currently raise. Harold Briggs spent nearly an hour going through the ledgers. He read them the way they deserved to be read, carefully, and in order, following the handwriting from Nora's father's entries in the old volumes through to Nora's own neat columns in the newer ones. He knew her name. Of course he did. Everybody in Sanders County knew Nora Calloway, but when he closed the last ledger and folded his hands on top of it, it was not her name that had persuaded him. It was the numbers. The numbers were what they were, patient and unambiguous. 13 years of a woman keeping her own books in her own hand, and they did not lie, and they did not exaggerate, and they did not ask for anything except to be read. Harold Briggs approved a line of credit for $275,000. Now let me take you back to town, because while Nora was quietly building her future at a kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a calculator older than her grandson, the beautiful, clean system Derek Sims had constructed on his tablet was meeting the real world for the first time. The Biomass Pacific trucks were based in Spokane, 220 miles away. 220 miles, it turns out, is a serious distance to depend on when you have 18 tons of wet organic material that begins to turn within 48 hours. The first month went reasonably well. The second month, the truck broke down on a pass road in bad weather, and the mill was left with 2 weeks of accumulated residual in the holding area with nowhere to go. October in western Montana is not July, but even in October, 18 tons of fermenting hardwood material in an enclosed holding space produces a smell that is not subtle and does not stay put. The mill sat on the eastern edge of town, not far enough east. 3 families downwind filed formal complaints with the county health office within the same week. A health inspector appeared. Citations were issued. To bring the facility into compliance, Derek had to spend $14,000 on a sealed negative pressure containment system for the holding area. Then, Biomass Pacific, citing softening demand in the industrial boiler fuel market and invoking a price adjustment clause buried in paragraph 11 of the contract, reduced their offered rate from $48 per ton to $29. Derek's beautiful $44,000 per year had become at best $27,000, from which you subtracted the $14,000 containment system, from which you subtracted the ongoing operational cost of running it, and the administrative time spent managing the citations and the neighbor complaints, and the scheduling coordination with a trucking operation 200 miles away that treated the Orlin account as exactly the kind of minor peripheral contract it was. The spreadsheet had been elegant. The real world was expensive, and it smelled bad, and it was not finished finding new ways to be complicated. Grant Orlin called Nora one evening in the early spring of 2018. He did not say much. He was not a man who used words when silence would do. He just said that he was sorry about how it had gone, and that he thought she had deserved better, and that the arrangement had worked fine for 10 years, and he wished it had been left alone. Nora listened and thanked him, and told him it was not his fault, and she meant it fully because it was not. After she hung up, she sat in her father's office for a while in the lamplight. She could hear Cole moving around in the kitchen, making dinner home for a long weekend from Missoula, doing the dishes in the particular quiet way he had been doing the dishes lately, the way of someone who is working something out. She opened the bottom drawer and took out the newest ledger and opened it to the current page, and she wrote down the date and the weather and the state of the herd and the balance of the account at the agricultural bank and the names of the 11 restaurants on the waiting list and the projected revenue for the coming year. She wrote it all down in her careful, even hand, the way her father had written it down before her, the way his father had written it down before him. The land keeps its own books. She turned the page to the next blank column, and she began the next entry. And outside the kitchen window, the west field lay dark and rich under the March sky, and the timber stood in rows to the north. And somewhere in it, the Ossabaw herd was moving quietly in the last of the light, unhurried, purposeful, doing what they had been bred across a decade of careful selection, to do, thriving on ground that the whole world had once called worthless, producing something rare and true from what everyone else had called waste. She wrote until she had written everything down. Then she closed the book and held it in her hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the particular dense weight of a thing that has been faithfully recorded. And she put it back in the drawer and closed the drawer and went to the kitchen where her grandson was setting the table for dinner without being asked. Cole stayed that weekend, and then he stayed the next one, and the one after that. He did not announce it. He did not sit his grandmother down and make a speech about coming home, or what it meant, or what he had decided. He just kept showing up on Friday evenings and not leaving until Monday morning. And then one Friday he came with more boxes than usual in the back of his truck. And Nora saw them from the kitchen window and did not say anything about it and set an extra place at the table. And that was the whole conversation. He called his firm in Missoula and negotiated a remote arrangement for the short term. And then 3 months later, when the short term had quietly become something else, he gave notice. He drove down on a Thursday, cleaned out his desk, shook hands with people he had genuinely liked working with, and drove back north on the same highway he had driven south on 8 years ago, when he was 18 and carrying 3 boxes and a duffel bag, and the particular kind of pride that is mostly just distance wearing a better coat. The distance was still in him. He knew it. Nora knew it. Neither of them had named it yet, but it was there the way old fence lines are there in the ground. Under the grass, still marking something even after the posts have gone, he threw himself into the work, the way a person throws themselves into something when they are not yet ready to throw themselves into the conversation that actually matters. He made proper invoices. He built a system for tracking every sale, every animal, every delivery, every dollar in and every dollar out. A clean digital record that ran parallel to his grandmother's handwritten ledgers. The two systems feeding each other, the old knowledge and the new tools. Finding a working agreement. The way people find a working agreement when they are both honest about what they do not know. He drove to town and sat down with the 11 chefs on the waiting list and had real conversations about volume and pricing and what they could expect and when. He talked to 2 more restaurants in Missoula who had heard about the Callaway operation through the particular informal network that serious cooks use to find serious ingredients, a network built entirely on the currency of one person. Telling another person that something was worth the drive. He took the $275,000 line of credit, and he and Nora mapped out exactly how to use it. Not quickly. They sat at the kitchen table with the legal pad and the ledgers, and they worked through it the way Nora had worked through everything methodically, starting with what was certain and moving outward from there. First, they bought a used 32-ton grain silo secondhand from a retiring wheat farmer, 2 counties east for $9,000. Then Nora drove out and sat at the kitchen tables of two local farmers she had known for 20 years. A man named Dale Harker, who grew barley on the benchlands above the river, and a woman named Ruth Stetson, whose family had been growing field corn in the valley for 3 generations. She offered them both a fixed price for their entire crop, a price better than the commodity market had given either of them in the last 4 years, and she offered them the same thing every year going forward. A steady customer who would not vanish when the prices shifted. Both of them shook on it before she finished the sentence. Then she bought a used grinder mixer for $6,000 and spent 2 weeks with it, learning exactly how to replicate the nutritional profile of the fermented hardwood residual diet. Her herd had been on for 10 years. The oak and hickory mash had been high in complex carbohydrates and fermentable fiber, and the particular aromatic compounds that came from the wood itself, and had worked their way into the fat of every ossebow on the property. She could not recreate it exactly, but she could get close enough to maintain what her customers were paying for. And she could control the inputs now in a way she never could when the material arrived twice a week from someone else's operation. Her costs went up. There was no avoiding that. The raw material that had arrived free for 10 years now had a price attached to it, and that price changed the arithmetic of the whole enterprise in ways that had to be accounted for honestly and without wishful thinking. She raised her prices to the restaurant buyers by 8%. She wrote each of them a letter by hand, a single page, explaining what had changed and why, and what she was doing about it, and what they could expect going forward. Not one of them pushed back. Not one called to negotiate or complain or suggest that perhaps they should look elsewhere. Several of them wrote back. Jessie from the Missoula restaurant wrote a full page. She said that she had been buying from Nora Calloway for 3 years and had never once had a reason to question a single thing about what arrived at her back door. And that 8% was not a number she was going to lose any sleep over, when what she was buying was something she could not find anywhere else in the state. By then, they were not just buying pork. They had been buying for 3 years now, something harder to source and impossible to fabricate. They were buying a story that was true, and in a world full of things performing the appearance of authenticity, a thing that was genuinely what it claimed to be had a value that no efficiency director's spreadsheet had a column for. Now I have to tell you what happened to Preston Wade, because you have been carrying him since the auction barn, since the sound of his voice filling that building on a cold Saturday morning, and you deserve to know where he ended up. The same wave that had been lifting Nora Calloway for a decade had been moving in exactly the opposite direction for Preston Wade, and he had not seen it coming because he had been too busy being right about everything to notice the water changing around him. The market for commodity pork had been softening since 2015. Not collapsing, not dramatically, just softening in the way that markets soften when the underlying conditions that created them begin to shift. And the people most invested in the old conditions are the last ones to admit it is happening. Preston Wade had 3,000 head in climate-controlled confinement barns and contracts with 2 regional processors, and a cost structure built on the assumption that the current price environment was a permanent feature of the landscape, rather than a moment in a longer cycle. He had borrowed to expand in 2014. He had borrowed again in 2016 to upgrade his ventilation systems after a regulatory change required it. The debt was manageable when the margins held. When the margins began to compress, it stopped being manageable with a speed that surprised him, the way these things always surprise the people they happen to, even when. In retrospect, the signs were there for anyone willing to read them. He lost his primary processor contract in the spring of 2017. The processor had been acquired by a larger company that was consolidating its supplier base, and Preston's operations, solid by the standards of 5 years ago, did not meet the new scale requirements. He found a replacement contract, but at a worse price. Then the replacement processor had its own difficulties, and the payments started coming late and then later. And then not at all for 3 months, while lawyers argued about something in a contract Preston had not read carefully enough. The cash flow dried up the way it dries up when you have fixed costs that do not negotiate and variable revenue that has decided to become unreliable. He sold the smallest barn first, hoping it would be enough. It was not enough. He sold a second one the following year and used the proceeds to service the debt on the third and fourth, and tried to believe that this was the bottom, that the next quarter would stabilize, that the fundamentals of what he had built were sound enough to hold. They were not sound enough. The fundamentals had been built for a world that was no longer the world. On a gray afternoon in October of 2018, Preston Wade drove down a gravel lane he had never driven down before. He had been past the Callaway place on the main road 100 times over the years. Everyone in Sanders County had been past it. It was simply part of the landscape of the county, the way certain landmarks become part of the landscape over time. But he had never turned down the lane. He had never had a reason to. He parked in the yard. He sat in the truck for a moment before he got out, which was not something Preston Wade had ever done before in his life. He had always been a man who got out of the truck quickly and moved toward things with the momentum of someone who had decided in advance that they were going to be fine. He got out slowly. Nora was near the equipment shed replacing a worn sprocket on the utility cart chain drive. She heard the truck and turned and looked, and did not move toward him or away from him. She waited the way she waited for everything, with a patience that had nothing performative about it. Cole was at the house. He came out onto the porch when he heard the unfamiliar engine and stood there, not sure what he was looking at. Nora looked at him over Preston Wade's shoulder and made a small motion with her head, the kind of motion that means what it has always meant between people who know each other well. "Give us a minute." Cole went back inside. Preston Wade crossed the yard with his cap in his hands. He was thinner than the man Nora remembered from the auction barn 12 years ago. The clean-pressed Saturday shirt was gone, replaced by a work shirt gone pale from washing, the kind of shirt that used to be a specific color and is now just the memory of it. The prosperous ease she remembered had been replaced by something careful, something that was managing its own weight. He stopped a few feet from her and stood there. He turned the cap over once in his hands, and then stopped doing that too, because there was nothing left to do with your hands in a moment like this, except let them be empty. He could not get the first sentence started. He tried twice. The third time, something came out. "I lost it all, Nora," he said. His voice was rougher than she remembered, like something that had not been used much lately. "Every barn, every acre. The bank has it now." She did not say anything. She set down the wrench and she waited, because she understood that what he had come to say was not yet said, and that the only way to get to it was to let the silence do its work. He looked out past her at the timber where the Ossabaw herd was moving in the pale October light. The dark shapes of them, slow and purposeful among the trees, the particular, unhurried quality that had always been the thing that made people who did not understand them call them worthless. "You want to know what actually kills me?" he said. He was looking at the pigs, not at her. "It is not the money. God knows it should be. But it is not the money." He paused. "It is that I stood up in that auction barn and I said what I said, in front of the whole county. I made every man in that building laugh at you and your animals." He shook his head once. "And the whole time, Nora, the whole entire time, you were the only one in that room who understood what any of it was actually worth. I spent 30 years measuring every living thing I owned in pounds per day. Turns out I did not understand the first thing about feeding animals or reading land or much of anything at all that actually matters. He let out a long breath. I was the one raising garbage, he said. I just could not smell it on myself. Here is the moment. The real one. The one that matters more than the check or the ledger or any number written on any page. When the wind has finally shifted and the whole county is watching, and the man who stood at the front of the auction barn is standing in your yard with his cap in his hands, and 30 years of wrong-headed certainty finally settled into a weight. He has to carry himself. A person has a choice about who they are going to be. Nora Calloway could have let him stand there in the cold and earn every second of it. She had 12 years of it behind her, 12 years of quiet work while his laughter was still somewhere in the air of that county. And there is not a person on this earth who would have faulted her for it. Not one. She walked over to him, not quickly. With the same unhurried deliberateness she brought to everything. She came and stood beside him, shoulder close to shoulder, and she looked out at the same timber he was looking at the dark shapes of the Ossabaw in the afternoon light. You think I never had a moment of doubt about any of this, she said. She said it quietly, not performing it for anyone, just saying the true thing. One winter I lost a third of my herd. I drove into town one morning and sat in my truck at the edge of the road for a long time, with my hand on the door handle. Closer to walking away from the whole thing than I have ever told anyone. Preston Wade looked at her. It was not stubbornness that kept me here, she said. And it was not confidence. It was just deciding to drive home and do the work one more day. She paused. That is all it ever is. She turned and looked at him directly, the same way she had looked at him across the auction ring 12 years ago. But different now, without the crowd, without the performance, without anything between them except two people standing in a yard in October. A man who can stand in someone's yard and say out loud that he was wrong, she said, has already done the hardest part. Most people spend their whole lives finding ways not to get there. He looked at her without speaking for a moment, not quite understanding where she was going. I have more orders than I can fill, she said. She looked back at the timber. 2 years on the waiting list now. And I need someone who knows hogs, not as a number on a spreadsheet. Hogs. Someone who is not too proud to learn a different way of doing the thing. She let the silence sit for a beat. If you wanted honest work, Preston, there is honest work here. He stared at her. He was a big man, had always been a big man, and standing in her yard in that pale shirt. He looked like a smaller version of the person who had filled the front of an auction barn with his certainty and his laughter. His eyes filled and spilled over, and he did not try to hide it, and she did not look away. Why he managed finally, after everything, after what I did to you, in front of everybody. Why would you do that? And Nora said the truest thing she knew. The thing her father had planted in her so long ago that it had grown into something she could not separate from herself anymore. The way a grafted tree cannot separate from its rootstock. Because my daddy taught me, she said, that you do not measure a person by what they take. You measure them by what they manage to give back. And you have got a great deal more left to give than you think you do, Preston. You just spent the first part of it on the wrong thing. Cole was standing inside the kitchen door. He had not gone upstairs the way his grandmother had gestured. He had stood just inside the glass and watched the whole thing. Watched his grandmother cross the yard to stand beside the man who had made a room full of people laugh at her. Watched her look out at her own timber, as if it were simply the most natural thing in the world to extend a hand to someone who had not earned it. He stood there for a long time after Preston Wade's truck had gone back up the lane. Then he went and sat at the kitchen table, and he did not say anything for a while, and Nora came in and put the kettle on and did not push him. Finally, he said, "I was 17. Those boys from town came out here and they laughed at the pile, and I laughed with them." Nora poured the hot water into the cups and carried them to the table and sat down across from him. "I know," she said. "You knew. I heard it from the kitchen window." Cole looked at the table. "You never said anything." Nora wrapped her hands around her cup. "You were 17 years old," she said, "and you were scared of what people thought. That is not a character flaw. That is just being 17. I stayed away," Cole said. "All those years. The calls that did not say anything." He stopped. "You came back," Nora said simply. He looked up. "You came back," she said again. "And you stayed." She looked at him steadily with the same patience she brought to every living thing she had ever cared for. "That is the whole of it, honey. People think the story is in the leaving. It is not. The story is always in the coming back." Cole sat with that for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the west field lay dark and still under the evening sky, the quarter-acre of ground that had been the sorriest piece of dirt in Sanders County for as long as anyone could remember. The ground that smelled like a lumber yard and a bad decision. The ground that a 14-year-old boy had held his nose at on the first delivery in 2006. The soil there now was black to a depth you could sink your arm into. The richest ground on the property. The richest ground very possibly in the county. Preston Wade came to work the following spring. He came on a Monday morning in March, driving a truck that was older and quieter than the one Nora remembered. And he stood in the yard and waited to be told what needed doing with the same cap-in-hand humility he had brought to the October conversation. And Nora put him to work, the same way she put every new thing to work, without ceremony and without condescension. Just the task and the expectation that it would be done properly. It took him time. A long commodity man does not unlearn 30 years of measuring in a single season. There were mornings when she could see him fighting the old instinct, the impatience with slowness, the reflex to optimize for weight and speed. She did not correct him loudly. She just kept showing him the other way day after day, the scatter feeding the reading of temperament, the waiting the particular quality of attention that the Asabao required, and that the confinement barn had never asked of anyone. He learned it, slowly and seriously, the way a person learns something they have finally decided they actually want to know. He learned to read a sow's posture from 50 feet away. He learned which animals to watch in cold weather and which ones would manage on their own. He learned over the course of that first year to look at the timber in the morning light, the way Nora looked at it, not as an inventory of pounds on the hoof, but as a living system doing its patient work. He never called any living thing garbage again, not once for the rest of his life. 11 months after the last delivery from Orland Brothers, a letter arrived at the farm. No company letterhead. Plain white envelope, handwritten address, a Spokane postmark. Inside was a single page handwritten on plain paper, no paragraphs, just lines. It was from Derek Sims. He had heard through someone at the mill how the Biomass Pacific arrangement had gone. The containment citations. The price reduction. The neighbor complaints. The true cost of what had seemed on a tablet screen on a Tuesday morning like an elegant and obvious optimization. He wrote the real arithmetic. Not the kind that fits in a clean column. The other kind. The kind you can only do honestly when it is too late to change anything, lying awake with the numbers in your head that refuse to become the numbers you wanted them to be. He wanted her to know that she had been right, that he had been wrong, that he was sorry for it. Cole was at the kitchen table when Nora read it. He watched her read it once standing at the counter. She did not read it again. She folded it along its original creases and she carried it down the hall to her father's office. And she opened the bottom drawer of the roll-top desk, and she laid the letter flat against the inside cover of the most recent ledger. And she closed the drawer. Cole appeared in the doorway. "Why are you keeping that?" he asked. "Because it is part of the record," Nora said. A man sat down and wrote out by hand that he was wrong. That is not a common thing. She pushed the drawer closed. It is worth keeping. Be glad in your heart when someone finally gets there. Most people never do. In September of 2019, Cole sat at the kitchen table and closed the books on the first full year of independent operation. The first year without a single load of material from anyone else. The first year built entirely on Nora's own inputs. Her own feed, her own land, her own labor. Beholden to no mill and no handshake arrangement, and no clever young man with a tablet. He added the sales. 230 hogs sold directly to 14 restaurants across Montana and into Idaho. He subtracted every cost. The grain from Dale Harker and Ruth Stetson. The fuel and the processing at the small family slaughterhouse 40 minutes east that had been in the same family since 1962. The vet. The fencing supplies. Every penny accounted for the way his grandmother had taught him, the way her father had taught her, the way the Callaway family had kept its books for 4 generations on this same piece of ground. The profit for that one year was $203,800. He wrote it down in the ledger in his own hand. Then he wrote out the check at the kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon in September. Every digit and every cent in black ink, and he carried it to his grandmother, where she was sitting in the front room with the evening light coming through the west window, and he set it on the arm of her chair. She looked at it for a long moment. She did not pick it up immediately. She looked at it the way she looked at all things that were finished, with the particular quiet attention of someone who has waited a long time for something and has not lost the capacity to be still in the presence of it when it finally arrives. "This is proof," Cole said. He sat down across from her. Of all of it, every decision they laughed at. Nora looked at the check. Then she looked up at her grandson. "Proof," she said, "is just what a record looks like when enough time has passed." She folded her hands in her lap. "Your great-grandfather kept records. Your grandfather kept them. I kept them. And now you keep them. That is the whole of what this is." 2 years later, in the autumn of 2021, Nora Callaway fell ill in the way that strong people fall ill quickly, and without the warning that would have allowed anyone to prepare adequately for it. She was 75 years old. She had been going at full capacity 6 weeks before, and then she was not. And the space between those two things was shorter than it had any right to be. She died in the house where she had been born, the house where she had buried her husband in her heart, and buried her daughter in the ground, and raised her daughter's son, and built from a pile of sawmill waste on the worst quarter-acre of her property, something that would outlast her by generations, if Cole tended it right. He was holding her hand. In the weeks before she died, she called him into her father's office one afternoon, and she opened the bottom drawer of the roll-top desk, and she lifted out the ledgers, all of them, the old ones with August Callaway's handwriting, and the newer ones with her own, the full weight of 4 generations of careful record-keeping, and she set them in Cole's hands. He felt the weight of them, the particular dense weight of a thing that has been faithfully tended across a very long time. "What do I do with them?" he asked. He was 30 years old, and he had been running the operation for 3 years, and he knew exactly what to do with them. And they both knew. He knew, but he asked anyway because it was the right question. For the moment, the question that acknowledged what was being handed to him. You keep them, Nora said. You write down every animal and every sale and every cost and every load of anything that comes onto this property. The same as I always did. She looked at him steadily the way she had looked at everything in her life, with the full weight of her attention and without hurry. Because the books do not lie, Cole. And the books do not forget. She paused. The whole world out there is going to spend the rest of your life trying to tell you that the valuable thing is the thing you can see and measure and hold. The number on a screen. The price per pound. The bottom line on a quarterly report. She folded his hands around the ledgers and held them there, her worn hands over his, the calluses and the history of them. But the real asset was never the wood chips, she said. It was never the free material, or the clever arrangement, or the favorable deal. The real asset is the knowing what to do with what everybody else throws away, the patience to wait for it to become what it can become, the willingness to keep the books faithfully, even when the books are showing you something that hurts. She patted his hands once. Everything else, she said, every single other thing, is just a temporary input. Cole runs the farm now. The Ossabaw herd is at 64 breeding sows. The waiting list for their pork runs 18 months. Preston Wade worked there until his knees finally made the decision for him. And in the years between October of 2018 and the morning he hung up his work gloves, for the last time he and Nora became something that neither of them would have named directly, but that everyone who watched it understood was a kind of friendship, built late, built from unlikely materials, built the way the best things on that property had always been built. Slowly and on difficult ground and without any guarantee of what it would become. Cole keeps the books by hand in the leather ledgers in his own careful writing, the way his grandmother taught him at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon, with a yellow legal pad and a calculator older than he was. He keeps a digital backup on the computer. But the real books are the ones in the bottom drawer, and the quarter acre down by the west fence line, the worst ground on the Callaway property for as long as anyone could remember. The ground where, for 10.5 years, the fermented waste of a sawmill was dumped twice a week in a steaming pile that a 14-year-old boy once held his nose at and begged his grandmother to give up on that ground, is the best ground on the farm now. The soil there is black and deep and soft, and you can sink your arm into it to the elbow. The worst ground became the best ground. That is not a story somebody made up to illustrate a point. That is what happened out by the fence in the early mornings while the world was looking somewhere else. In the last autumn before she died, Nora planted something in that corner. She planted it on her knees in the black soil she had made from what everyone had called worthless. She planted a grove of American chestnuts, a dozen young trees spaced wide the way the old books said to space them. The American chestnut is a tree with a particular and famous slowness to it. It grows the way all the best things grow, carefully underground, first establishing its roots before it commits to anything visible. A tree that an old woman planting on her knees in October knew with certainty she would never live to sit beneath. She planted it anyway. One last patient investment. One last entry in the record. One last proof that real wealth is not a number in a ledger, but a living thing. A thing that can lose half of itself in one hard winter and grow back from what survived, a thing that reaches forward into time past the length of any one person's life. The chestnuts are growing now, slowly as they do, putting down the roots that have to come before the height. Cole checks on them in the morning sometimes, walking the fence line the way his grandmother walked it, in the early light before the rest of the work begins. He looks at the young trees, and he thinks about what his grandmother told him the last time she handed him a cup of coffee at the kitchen table the morning before. The morning everything got harder. She said, "The land remembers what it has been given. It keeps its own books." She smiled the small, private smile he had known his whole life. the smile she gave to things she was certain about. Your job is just to keep showing up and keep making the deposits. He walked back up the lane toward the house. The mountains were going pink in the east. The Ossabaw were moving in the timber dark and unhurried in the early light, doing what they had been bred across 20 years of careful mornings to do. The black soil in the west corner caught the first light and held it. The chestnut trees stood small and serious in their row deep in the work of becoming. Cole went inside. He hung his coat on the hook. He poured his coffee. He went to his great-grandfather's desk, and he opened the bottom drawer, and he took out the ledger, and he opened it to the current page, and he picked up the pen, and he wrote down the date, and the weather, and the state of the herd, and everything that had come in and everything that had gone out the way it had been done on this land for 4 generations, the way it would be done if he did his part for 4 more. The books do not lie, and the books do not forget.